let's kick things off with an idea that's, well, it's pretty powerful and honestly a little unsettling. Think about this. What if the villains from our history books, the ones we're told are just plain evil, what if they weren't born that way? What if they were made?
So yeah, that's what we're digging into today. We've got 3 true stories about people who were pushed so far by a corrupt system that they just snapped. They became outlaws, killers, and somehow legends. It really makes you wonder, right? What happens when a system gets so bad that everyday folks start cheering for the criminals?
All right, let's head to our first story. Picture this, the dusty, totally lawless backlands of Brazil in the early 1900s. I mean, this was a place where justice was basically a word for something you could buy if you had the money. Most people didn't.
You see, this place wasn't really run by a government. No, it was ruled by these guys called the coronéis. Think of them like medieval warlords. They were super wealthy landowners with their own private armies, and yet they had the local cops right in their pockets. And this is the brutal world that a young guy named Virgulino Ferreira da Silva, just a simple farmer's son, was born into.
Just look at this timeline. It's a story of a system completely failing someone. Virgulino's father, he did everything by the book. He went to the law, he tried to get away from the trouble. But the system, it wasn't there to protect him. It was used as a weapon against him. After he watched cops, who were basically just hired thugs for a rich family, beat his father half to death and then come back later to murder him and burn their house down, well, Virgulino decided that if the law wouldn't give him justice, he'd find it himself, with a gun.
So he and his brothers, they took off and joined up with the Cangaceiros. Now, these guys weren't just your average bandits. They were almost a social phenomenon, a direct response to this whole oppressive system. They had their own code, their own style, and Virgulino, man, he was a natural. He got the nickname Lampião, which means the lantern, because he could fire his rifle so fast, the flashes from the muzzle looked like a lamp flickering in the dark.
But here's where it gets complicated. He wasn't some simple Robin Hood character. I mean, sure, he robbed from the rich coroneles who'd ruined his life, and he spent that money with local shopkeepers, pumping up the local economy. He was super religious, always praying in churches. But at the same time, his methods were just terrifyingly brutal. He would torture his enemies and gave zero mercy to the police, who to him were the face of the corrupt system he hated. So, to the poor, he was a hero. To the government, he was an absolute monster, a walking contradiction.
Eventually, his run came to an end. But check out how the government responded. It was just as savage as anything he ever did. They didn't just kill him, they cut off his head and the heads of his partner, Maria Bonita, and the rest of his gang, and they put them on display in town squares for over 30 years. It was a gruesome, unmistakable message. Don't you dare try this again.
Okay, so from the dry backlands of Brazil, let's jump over to the rugged bush of colonial Australia. Because it's here that another young man born into a tough life of poverty and injustice would become one of the most famous figures in his country's history and one of its most wanted criminals.
The thing about Ned Kelly's story that just grabs you is this stark contrast right at the beginning of his life. At 11 years old, he's a local hero for saving another kid from drowning. Amazing, right? But then, just a year later, at 12, his father dies from hard labor, punishment for stealing a calf just to feed his starving family. Suddenly, Ned's the man of the house, and crime looks like the only option. It wasn't really a choice, you know. It was a path laid out for him by a system that seemed designed to punish the poor for just trying to stay alive.
And then you get to this moment, the absolute breaking point. A drunk police officer harasses his family, and who gets punished? His mother. She's sentenced to 3 years of hard labor. Ned even offers to surrender, a straight trade, his freedom for hers. The police say no. For Ned, that was it. That was the proof that the whole system wasn't just broken, it was actively cruel. So, he declared war.
He and his crew, the Kelly gang, they weren't just robbing people for cash. No, they were hitting the symbols of their oppression. There's this famous story where, during a bank robbery, he burns a huge pile of mortgage documents. He literally set people free from their debt to the banks. You can see why he wasn't just seen as a thief. He was staging acts of rebellion, and that's why all the struggling farmers started looking at him like a hero.
The government's reaction? It was huge. They slapped a bounty on his head that, if you convert it to today's money, is over $1.5 million. This was way more than just a manhunt. It was an all-out war, and the authorities were ready to pay anything to bring him down.
And this war reached its climax at a place called Glenrowan. It was this crazy, desperate plan to trap and ambush an entire train full of police reinforcements. The plan goes sideways, but it leads to one of the most legendary shootouts in history, with the Kelly gang walking out of a burning building wearing homemade, bulletproof armor made from farm plows. Can you just imagine that scene? These figures in iron armor making a final, doomed stand against the system that was hunting them.
He was eventually captured, shot in the legs where the armor didn't cover him. But even facing the hangman's noose at just 25, his defiance became legendary. His supposed last words, "Such is life," have echoed through history, cementing his legacy not just as an outlaw, but as this powerful symbol of resistance.
Okay, so our first two stories were about men fighting back. But what happens when the system isn't just corrupt, but is designed from the ground up to crush you simply for who you are? Our final story it's probably the most harrowing of all. It's the story of Phoolan Devi, a woman who survived things you can't even imagine and rose to become a symbol of vengeance and ultimately power.
To even begin to understand Phoolan Devi's life, you have to get your head around the caste system in India. It's this incredibly rigid social pyramid, and her family was way down at the bottom. And what that meant, in practical terms, was that from the day she was born, she had no power, no voice, and absolutely zero legal protection against abuse from people in higher castes.
This timeline, it's just brutal. Her entire childhood and young adult life was just this relentless cycle of violence and abuse. And the worst part? It often came from the very people who were supposed to be authority figures. Her own family, her husband, the police. Every person in a position of power in her life was a source of unbelievable pain, not safety. The system didn't just fail her. It was an active participant in her torture.
But then, in the absolute darkest place imaginable, something shifts. In a bandit camp where she's been taken, another bandit named Vikram actually stands up for her. He kills her main abuser. And for the very first time in her life, someone treats Phoolan with kindness, with respect. They fall in love, and for a short time they become this renegade couple, leading raids against the upper caste villages that had hurt her so badly.
This little bit of happiness, though, it's tragically cut short. Vikram is murdered by rival bandits from a higher caste. And after his death, and after she suffers even more humiliation, Phoolan's mission changes. It's not about rebellion anymore. It's about pure, cold revenge. This leads to the infamous Baymai massacre, where she rounded up 22 upper caste men she held responsible and had them executed. It was an act of retribution so shocking it made her the most wanted woman in all of India.
And then comes the twist that sounds like it's straight out of a movie, but it's real. After years on the run, she surrenders and goes to prison. But when she gets out, the woman who the government hunted as a terrorist runs for parliament and wins. The bandit queen becomes an elected official, using her new power to fight for the poor and the downtrodden. It's an absolutely mind-blowing transformation.
So let's just pull back for a second here. Lampião, Ned Kelly, Phoolan Devi, a Brazilian bandit, an Australian folk hero, an Indian politician. On the surface, they seem so different, but what's the thread that connects these three violent, complex, and oddly celebrated people?
Look at the pattern. It's impossible to miss. None of them started out as monsters. They all came from poor, marginalized backgrounds. Every single one of them tried to live within the rules at first. But for each of them, there was that one moment, that breaking point, where the system, be it the police, the courts, the entire social order, inflicted a brutal, life-shattering injustice upon them. Violence wasn't their first move. You could argue it was the only move they felt they had left.
Which leaves us with a final, really important question to chew on. When we see figures like these emerge from the wreckage of a broken society, we have to ask ourselves, are we looking at people who are just born evil, or are we actually looking at a reflection of the monstrous system that created them in the first place?